Good afternoon. Well, I can introduce you to most of the panel. We're still waiting for one panelist, Graham Bishop, to arrive. But on my left, we have Philip from Restov. He's Deputy CEO of Luxembourg for Finance. And then we have Hubertus Vett, who is Managing Director of Frankfurt Main Finance. And so we have a continental panel at the moment. I'm sure Graham will turn up to give us his views soon. My name, by the way, is Hugh Jones. I cover financial regulation for Reuters News. I've been based in New York, London, and in Brussels. I think, given the what's happening, we have the Tory Party conference today, desperately trying to come up with some sort of Brexit deal that hasn't been leaked within 10 minutes. Perhaps you can tell us, I remember on the day after the referendum, some people in the city were saying it's the end of the city, bankers will move, 70,000 bankers will move to Frankfurt or Paris. I think so far maybe about 1,000, 2,000 have moved, but then again Brexit hasn't actually happened. How do you see Brexit eventually disrupting the trend for financial centres in Europe? Are you going to be the big winner? Are you both going to be winners? Or is it somewhere else in the world? Maybe, Hubertus, we can start with you.
We'll see lots of winners. First of all, there is no other place. Welcome, Graham. There will be no continental European financial centre that would take up the position London has. So London will remain Europe's foremost financial centre. So that's beyond any doubt. But it's going to lose out. It's going to lose out to the US, it's going to lose out to Asia, and it's going to lose out to some continental European centres as well. It's going to be a significantly more fragmented landscape which we're having, which we all know is not particularly efficient. There has been a reason why resources have been pulled together here in London, and spreading them out over various locations is not the most efficient way to do. That's why we believe there will be 2 to 3 phases. The phase number 1 is basically that you manage to get the ground laid, that you can continue with your business, as regulators require certain minimum standards in terms of people and systems, and particularly risk management and senior people. And then you will sort of have the actors see how it goes, how it actually will emerge, the Brexit. As we all know as of today, none of us knows how the picture will end up at the end of the day. And quite honest, everything is still possible. From the hardest of thinkable Brexits to another referendum, everything in between, and it's everybody's best guess. I'd like to quote Martin Wolf, which I meet at occasions. He said, my hypothesis for what's going to happen in Brexit today is, which is quite different of yesterday, and it's probably going to change tomorrow again. Mm-hmm. So who am I to know what's going to happen? And so what the industry needs to do, it needs to prepare itself for all eventualities. The regulators push for that. I think they're pretty well set up. The first race has been cleared. I think Frankfurt came out pretty well in the picture. We know it's a number that's not been published yet. Close to 60 applications of more than 50 financial institutions to set up in Frankfurt or to expand operations in Frankfurt. That compares pretty well, and amongst them the biggest US, the biggest Japanese banks. But the structure will be fragmented, and there will be a second and a third round of effect. But clear is London will lose, but it will lose in a limited extent, because none of the continental European financial centers would even be able to get close to the reach, the depths, and the London will and can continue to provide.
So it's not the end for the city then?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Philip, Luxembourg's done well, especially asset managers, insurers. Do you feel it's like a bonanza town there?
Well, let's say champagne hasn't been popping in Luxembourg after the referendum, and I do agree there are a lot of winners, but I think we think that everybody has lost too. Especially Europe has lost, the European single market has lost, and for Luxembourg we have lost a key ally when it comes to the integration of the financial markets.
Couldn't agree more with that.
Yeah. I suppose the level of damage to the city will depend on trade access to the EU in the future. Graham, what sort of access do you think we're going to get? I mean, we've been told equivalence is the best bet, but then again, that's not really automatic, is it?
Well, equivalence is the only bet, let's be clear. Not automatic, no. It's, the Commission has been putting out some stuff just over the summer. By chance, the Commission published a big review of their situation. I'm sure it was just a coincidence. And made it very clear that the equivalence is to protect the EU's single market, the EU's financial market, and EU savers. It's not to do business or make life easy for London or somewhere else. And indeed it is entirely discretionary, at the discretion of the Commission, moreover. And the problem is that we know that on day one, for the moment, let's say the 1st of November, I hope not, but let's say that, that the UK will be entirely aligned with the EU. But we do know that ever since the Lamfalussy process of 20 years ago now, there have been regular review clauses in all the directives and regulations. So that every 2 years typically, maybe too fast, but anyway, every 2 years they are reviewed. And the world moves on, the politics moves on, the technology moves on, and the EU will change its regulations, sometimes minor, sometimes very big ones. And think of the Investment Services Directive, so 20 years ago, MiFID 1, MiFID 2, MiFIR comes along. Things like that will happen again. And Solvency 2, you can talk about for insurance companies. So when that does happen, there will be a major sort of shifting of the approach of the EU. And the question for the UK, for the city, is do we go in lockstep? I hesitate to use the word vassal because that's perhaps quite emotive, but do we go in lockstep or do we not? And if we don't, the Commission set up a monitoring process and they will monitor this pretty quickly, particularly given the high risk of the city to the financial services sector of the EU, and they will say, you're not equivalent.
Mm.
So this is so within 2 years, typically, and it'll be 2 years in one place and 3 in another and so on, but over a period, most of the major financial services pieces of legislation will get reviewed, and if we don't go in lockstep, we're not equivalent. Full stop. And the businesses who you're optimistic will stay will see that coming and say, maybe we'll take precautions ahead of time.
And the whole purpose of Brexit is not to be lockstep.
Oh, it's to take back control. Oh, I remember now. Yes, sorry, I forgot. Right.
But don't
Yes,
you also
sorry,
sense that on the UK side, you're having speeches from the Financial Conduct Authority, Mark Carney saying, we want to be a rule taker. And also some hints in recent days from Sajid Javid, the Chancellor Exchequer, John Glenn, saying, well, we may do some things differently in regulations, a chance for a review. You're getting very strong hints that maybe, do they really want equivalence anyway?
Well, there you go then. If you don't want it, that's fine. You won't have it. That's very simple. Now then comes the question of what does that do for London-based business in Singapore or China? Not very much, I imagine. What does it do for London-based business in the EU?
I mean, the EU is a quarter of business for the city.
Yeah.
And also all the banks here have opened new hubs in the EU. So do you think there'll be any kind of open channels? I know Germany has passed laws to allow some loans, trading to continue, come what may, really.
Well, from my perspective, there's a thing called the single market, the idea of which is to have a single market across the EU. And if there are areas of activity which are not covered by that, if it's not a service under the MiFID then yes, Germany or France or anywhere can have their own rules for it. But if it is a MiFID service or insurance service, etc., then you comply with the single market rules. That's the whole purpose of it.
Yeah. I mean, some people are saying that the sort of finance activity that's going to Europe from here is very traditional stuff, really. Share trading, bond trading, weak purchase agreements trading. How much of that is really the future of financial services? And London's doing well in fintech. Berlin's been desperately trying to attract fintech firms from London. Isn't London right really to focus on fintech and future kind of technologies? Phil?
Well, we believe that in Europe we will have kind of a multipolarization of financial center who are complementary with each other. So there is probably a financial center focusing more on banking, the other one on insurance, asset management, fintech, and maybe become a European leader or a global leader. We believe that there, as we have said, there will be no financial center at par with London, and we don't see it in the future.
Does that matter?
No, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the European financial industry is stepping up against competition from the US and the rising Asian financial centers. We have to remain competitive, and therefore we have to take the single market further and the banking union further in order to have more integration.
Yeah, I would go as far as saying fintech are hopefully part of the solution, because the real challenge is big tech. It's not fintech, and hence it's the incumbent banks would do very well to think of strategies to integrate as early and as much of them as possible. And what we see when we see all those challenges, particularly also in the UK, the closer you get to a full banking license, the more they start to struggle. And regulation as such actually works as a barrier of entry into the market very clearly. And yet I'm a strong believer in technology. I believe there's lots of benefit in it, but I think the real challenge for banks is coming from big tech, and that should not be underestimated.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that. And I think we should just clarify what we mean a bit by fintech. As you say, as these companies approach becoming a bank, then they have to have a license. So much of fintech, the relevant fintech to the financial world, is payment systems.
Yeah.
And that is the province of banks, authorized by society so they don't steal your money or lose your money on the way. So as soon as you get to a scale, then you bump into those regulations. The other side is, what is it that's being transmitted? Is it crypto assets, or is it Bitcoin, as it were, or is it Libra? And Bitcoin, I have no particular brief for. It just seems to me that, as at the moment, of course, it could change in due course. The means of payment with it, what it's for, is very limited. Store of value, up and down like a yo-yo. So Libra, then, to get round all that, actually, as you look at it and think about it, it's going to be backed by a portfolio of currencies. That's an asset-backed security. It's a security. It's a MiFID thing. Where you will obey the MiFID rules. So, and then there's the question of anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist law, and whatever else. You can't begin to have the new crypto system be a sort of nirvana for drug dealers and terrorists and everything else. Society can't possibly allow that. So something has to happen there. And I think the fintech people who are going off down these paths haven't really thought through where that's going to take them. But already you see, Libra is actually, I think, being the catalyst of forcing, because of the scale of Facebook, it's actually forced the central banking and regulatory community to address what exactly is this, and where is it going, and if it goes there, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Okay. Perhaps we can, any questions from the audience about, we have one more. on Brexit, how you see financial centres in Europe developing. Is the city finished, or is it just a bit of a puncture and we're going to be fine?
It's just an observation.
Just introduce yourself, please.
It's very interesting what you've been talking about, equivalence, yeah?
Yeah.
And there's a prospect we are going to move away from Europe. I'm a technologist, and I participated in MIFID as it was being developed over many, many drafts. And that was driven by fintech, the idea of multilateral trading systems, dark pools, blah, blah, blah. And I have to say that the first drafts coming across from the EC were a dog's breakfast, really a dog's breakfast. And it was London's practitioners, along with the FSA, who knocked that into shape. So it was MIFID to me was a very London-centric development. And if we do move away from the EC, and we do have fintech here, I mean, it's going to be a very interesting scenario. What do you think, guys?
Well, and the role of the FSA and the city in tidying up, shall we say, these variety of directives was dramatic and very important. But if the city fragments, and some of it's in Frankfurt and some in Luxembourg, some in Amsterdam and Dublin, the people are there. They have got the internet, they've got telephones, etc. They can plug in and respond to the consultations, whereas they might all have been in the city before. Now they will be spread out. But the people and the firms will still be there, absolutely intending to make sure that sensible regulations appear and that the firm's interests are protected.
Whereas before it was actually quite coordinated, now it's going to be a little bit unstructured, but that could lead to innovation. And it could lead to London being non-equivalent, but in a better sort of way. I think that's the point I'm making.
It could be. I don't deny it. I mean, one of the things we haven't mentioned yet is that part of London's infrastructure is the legal system, English law. Is that going to be acceptable across the rest of the EU?
Well, we're already seeing in the derivatives sector where people are being offered French or German or Irish legal system for their contracts.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Nobody on? No, any thoughts on the Brexit and city centres in Europe? You just introduce yourself, please.
So, Roger Aitken, ex-FT journalist. Just wondered if you think if UK leaves Europe on 31st of October, deal or no deal, we should also consider ditching the MIFID rules.
Excuse me?
Ditching the MIFID rules as well?
Well, maybe as the home team I could say something about that. I think in the aftermath of the great financial crash, Parliament went through looking at what went wrong with the banking system in particular, and that was really about banking regulation rather than MiFID. But I think if we think that Parliament is going to give a license to shady characters to rip off their customers, I think I'd be quite surprised. There has been a backlash, and just think of PPI and all the other things, again banking rather than MiFID. But that corpus of rules have been shaped by the UK, agreed by the UK. Why would we now turn around and say they're all wrong, let's ditch the whole lot? It may be that there will be people who want to make a specific case on that bit, etc. Fine. You lose equivalence, fine. But complete ditching, I think I would be very surprised if the House of Commons was prepared to put its constituents at the risk of some of the practices of yesteryear.
I would even go further than you. It's not only been shaped, actually it was led.
Yes.
MiFID is a reflection of UK-based regulatory thinking. So it was here, more or less, where these initiatives started and were shaped, and not only influenced, though that would be a big surprise.
No, I'm a Remainer, but I mean, I'm only putting this to you because someone put this to me.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a Remainer too,
Yeah.
and that's my view.
Yeah.
Okay. You have a question in the back, Jay?
Gary Wright, BIS Research. Well, first is a comment, next is a question. first comment is the city has a long history of adapting. I mean, that's why it's still here. So I'm pretty damn sure that whatever's thrown at the city, it will adapt and evolve as it has always done. Anyway, the question is actually, I personally don't believe that Brexit's going to happen now. I think the odds are looking increasingly against it. The only way that I can see it happening is if the UK gets chucked out of Europe. I can't see it happening in any other way. But my question is really, can we dial back? Let's assume Brexit doesn't happen. With everything that's gone on, and the feeling across Europe, in the UK and everything else, can we just sort of say that this last 3 years never happened? Can we go back to square one and say, oh, you know, now everything's okay, guys? Or what will be the effect?
Very briefly, if anyone else.
Sorry.
No, I was saying not me, theoretically.
Well, clear answer is yes. Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, like what Philip said before, we're very sad. We are very sad to see the UK leave the Union. It's really bad for the Union. It's bad for each and every country in the Union. It's worst of all for the UK. Not to take it back or push the UK over the brink is something that just won't happen. What you will not see is a deal that somehow will put the UK in a better position than being a member of the Union. That won't happen. That's a pipe dream. But there will definitely be no pushing, and there clearly will be a taking back.
I think the lady on the side has a question. Okay, we'll have
Corey Cook, Cleveland Partners. I'd just be interested in hearing the panel's view. Philip Hammond, I think last year or the year before, mentioned or floated the ideas, Singapore upon Thames. And I haven't seen much of that in the press lately, and I'd just be interested in hearing the panel's viewpoint if that is a credible or fantasy.
right. Isn't that meant to be the biggest fear for France? That's that London will suddenly deregulate and go hell for leather.
No, I think I'm coming back to the point the gentleman made, that London has always knew how to reinvent itself, and I think this is key, because given the intensity of the discussion, we tend to forget the other strategic topics financial centers have to tackle for the future. Brexit might be in the short and medium term very important to us, but we have heard in the previous panel on the platformization, which is very important, which actually changes the very nature of the financial services we provide. And then we have, of course, the mainstreaming of sustainable finance. This is something, actually, strategically speaking, we are focusing on, because for us, Brexit is something we have been preparing for and be ready the 29th of March already. So whatever comes for us, it is somehow, we take it, but we have really other issues to tackle. And I think London too, and I think London will tackle them too.
Mm.
On that one, I would not wholeheartedly dismiss the idea of Singapore and the Thames. Why? I've been living in Singapore. I was 1988 there. I was part of a team that set up the first regional head office, which had a huge tax advantage, 10 years tax-free, for consolidating the profits from the entire region. It worked very nicely. And it was at a time where Singapore was not amongst the top 20 of the financial centers in the world, and you all know now it's amongst the top 5. It's doable, and there is definitely the option to do it. But the option would come at a price. And the clear price definitely would be that equivalence will be lost. And to put that in perspective, based on the deal that was reached under Theresa May, EY did a calculation that about, I think it was 1.2 or 1.3 trillion of assets will have to move onto the continent. That would probably increase by another 50% if that were to happen. So we're talking 2 trillion assets. Well, there might be conservative, traditional sort of business, but it's business, significant amount of business, and with it go jobs. So yes, it's doable. It's an option, and I'm sure a few people think along those lines. And I would not dismiss it right away as a pure pipe dream, but it would then clearly cut off the UK from the common market much harder than it's foreseeable at the moment.
I mean, you talk to many of the bankers, and most of them really say they want regulation to be predictable and steady, but they do want tax cuts.
Yeah.
And so are you saying that if Britain were to slash taxes for banks, that would jeopardize equivalence as well?
Well, tax not by itself.
Yeah.
It has to be
The unfair competition, you think?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
and the tax issue. The tax issue certainly would heighten the tension in
Yeah.
a sense that there probably would be more rigid on interpreting equivalence.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, okay, fair enough.
If I can just go back to can we reverse turn the clock back? I find that very difficult. I was listening to Boris Johnson this morning on the Today programme. There's the discussion about would we be a mutinous and difficult partner if we don't leave. So if that's the situation, I suspect most businesses would say, we've made these moves, we've spent the money, we're set up over there, we don't need to do it all, but do we reverse it and become 100% dependent on the UK again when there's that truculent attitude? I think not. Maybe if we had a referendum and it had the same result as 1975, which you will recall was 66-33, if that were to happen, that's a different matter, but I'm not holding my breath on that. Just on Singapore on Thames, regulation and so on is one thing. I remember speaking to a very large bank and talking to them about whether they would accept as a counterparty one of their opposite numbers in Singapore, and they laughed. In the end, yes, we're all too big to fail, etc. But if things do go wrong, you assume that the first thing is the country is going to stand behind its banks. Maybe it's as a process of too big to fail as you wind it all down. But on the day one, does the country stand behind it? And is Singapore capable of standing behind 3 or 4 of the world's largest banks? I think the answer is self-evident.
Any more questions on this topic? Yes, the lady on the side there.
Hi, my name is Vanya Damianova. I'm from S&P Global. My question is to the representatives of continental European centers. So basically, let's say Brexit happens, and then continental Europe and financial centers there have to take some of London's business. What are the risks? Firstly, we're not going to have one center, but many centers that are competing with each other. And while we have the single market, we don't have the CMU project completed or the European Banking Union project also completed. So what are the risks for business then? Because for cross-border bank mergers and consolidation, the incomplete banking union is the issue. And how does the incomplete CMU and the lack of debt in continental European capital markets will have an effect over, the next years? What do you think? What are the biggest risks?
That was to anyone other than me, I think.
Well, yes. Capital Markets Union, as I mentioned before, has to be pushed further. It is still too fragmented within the European Union in terms of regulation, in terms of licensing. So there we have to make a big step forward. Also for SMEs to have an opportunity to have access to cross-border financing, which is in continental Europe, unfortunately. Financing is done mostly at 80% by lending, so this is a trend we would like to invert, and therefore we have to push this.
When?
Well, that's a good question. When you see the Commission's agenda, the single market doesn't seem, for the time being, very high on the agenda. But believe me,
But if Brexit can't give a boost to say what can.
but believe me, financial markets actors are very actively pushing into the direction.
Okay. There's a question in the front.
Mike St. John Green in his presentations distinguished sort of plumbing from drains, and all this plumbing of mutual recognition, equivalence, passporting, we're very focused on financial services. Does the panel have any thoughts, though, about what happens if we break on GDPR? Are we kind of dead meat? So doesn't GDPR come along with any type of streamlining that involves us staying in some way in the European financial market?
I think we're passing the buck here. GDPR is not my strength, I must say. My vague understanding is that we have to be following European rules. So if we're, again, if we're not part of it, we follow those rules precisely, or the data doesn't flow. I think we call that the vassal state again, isn't it?
No, the Americans are not a vassal state, and they have to follow GDPR if they've got European investments or European anything.
Yeah, they can choose to do that. The point about the UK is if it's a major chunk of our business, then we have to. We could, of course, choose not to, which is, I suppose, the purpose of Brexit. But that would be economically damaging.
So an anecdotal observation on that one, Michael, is that the amount of storage capacity going up in continental Europe is huge, and the demand cannot be satisfied. I'll take that as anecdotal evidence of what fundamentally I believe that GDPR is something that where the European rules will be fully applied and strictly applied, because that's an extremely sensitive issue.
Perhaps we can, time is running out, perhaps we can look at other factors seem to be shaping the development of financial centres. And one interesting factor that's starting to crop up is political risk. We saw it in the Hong Kong Exchange's bid for the London Stock Exchange. Some analysts saying it's too risky, what's happening in China, what's happening in Hong Kong. We've seen it even in Britain, you know, the mess in the government, and people think the divisions are going to continue for years to come over trade. You're not going to get predictable government. Same with the United States with Trump over regulation, trade wars. How much do you think such political risks are going to shape who's going to win, who's going to lose in financial centres? I mean, the Europe looks like a haven of stability at the moment, I think.
It is. I would like to answer your question not in the perspective of risk, but in the perspective of opportunity. You've just returned from Toronto, and I found it remarkable in how quick a time Toronto emerged as the AI center, leading center in North America.
Well, why is that then?
And that is because the talent flows and the attractiveness of talent, and that was what London used to be good at, second to none. And that is what financial centers need to do. They need to be attractive for talent. They need to pull in people, and they need to be pulling people of all shapes and colors and nationalities and whatever, wherever they're from. And that is the ability to pull in that talent is absolutely key for the future of financial centers. So I would clearly say those countries and those cities that manage that are on the winning side.
I do agree.
I must say, I think political risk has more to it than just attracting talent. Clearly, Carlos Ghosn of Renault would say Tokyo is not very nice to him. But there's also things like currency depreciation. And if you've got a large, if you're Bloomberg sitting here with whatever billion the offices are, and the currency drops 20%, you're not going to be best pleased. Now, you may have hedged it, of course, or you may not. So currency depreciation out of the blue because of a political ruption is certainly going to be in the political risk category. And then, and inflation obviously goes with that from currency depreciation. But then you have arbitrary changes in the law. can you rely, and that's the hallmark of English law, it's one of the reasons why it's been such a boon for the financial services industry, because everyone relies on Britain's judiciary. The law is clear, and when it isn't clear, the judiciary clarify it, and that's fine, and everyone trusts it. Are we at the moment facing a challenge to the role of the judiciary? And if we start getting politicised judges, I'm now going down the road, just where does that take us? So I think there are several components to political risk, which goes clearly, talent is a key thing, but you can go more.
We have a question in the front here. I think we'll start with you, sir, then we'll come back to you.
Oh, 2 minutes, right.
I think political risk is a key, very difficult to quantify new element that the city's had some success. Some players have had some success. One of the biggest risks, I think, is at least in financial markets, is a transaction tax. What do the panelists believe are the risks with if Britain is out of the EU in this tumultuous populist time? Is there a higher risk for a transaction tax in Europe? What do you think of if the Democrats get in, of a transaction tax in the US? I think it's on the platform of 7 of the current 9 Democratic candidates. And then if Corbyn is here, will there be a transaction tax?
Well, we already have a transaction tax here called stamp duty. So this won't be a great surprise. If you extend that to bond transactions and currency transactions, that becomes a different matter. But on equity trading, which is where people tend to focus, we have it already.
And I don't think it's going to go beyond that in EU. Clearly not.
Okay, we may have 1 minute left. Any final
I think
questions?
Martin wanted to throw a hand grenade in.
Our next speaker.
Just a comment on Singapore on Thames. I actually wrote a column on this.
Very microphone.
I think it's a completely ludicrous idea for many reasons, and I actually know Singapore since 1972. But the really important thing to remember, it seems pretty banal to say it, contrary to the views from the financial sector, Britain is not a city-state. And the Brexit vote was the outcome of the fact that it is not a city-state.
Are you suggesting the City of London should declare independence?
I wrote a column 12 years ago arguing just that. Since it's not going to happen, how much they hate us, Singapore on Thames is not what's going to happen.
Yes.
Because this government, like any other conceivable government, main aim is going to be to raise revenue.
Yeah. And foreign exchange. And foreign exchange. The city earns, £75 billion of foreign exchange. Without that, our current account deficit doubles from appalling to unsustainable.
And
That's going to be lost.
and you also see the strains show in city-states, Hong Kong being one example, but you see it also in Singapore. When you know Singapore very well, you know what needed to be done to maintain political stability. It was quite far-reaching.
Yeah, I think that in the
Especially
immediate,
with elections is always a good idea.
I think in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, there was an idea just to have work visas for inside the M25.
Yes,
That
yes.
died a very quick death, I think. But I think we're running out of time. Thanks very much. The issues we cannot solve, and who knows what happens tomorrow that might change things again. So thanks very much, Roberta, Sir Graham and Philip. Thank you very much indeed.